When people hear the word Crusades, they usually imagine banners and prayers. Steel-clad knights riding east beneath sacred symbols. Wars framed as tests of faith, honor, and eternal reward. And belief did matter, immensely. It motivated vows, sacrifice, and endurance. But belief alone does not move continents. Belief does not provision armies for years at a time, does not construct fleets, mint coins, ensure cargo, or settle accounts when men fail to return. Armies do not march on conviction alone. They march on resources. At the end of the 11th century, Europe was not prepared for global war, was divided, cash-poor, and administratively fragile. Power was personal, not institutional. Wealth lived in land, not liquidity. Lords could command labor, but not capital. There were no permanent armies, no national treasuries, no financial machinery designed to sustain distant conflict. By every practical measure, the Crusades should have collapsed under their own weight. Instead, they did something far more consequential. They forced Europe to solve a problem it had never solved before: how to fund violence at scale, how to turn obligation into payment, how to convert moral certainty into material supply. In trying to reach Jerusalem, Europe accidentally built systems that outlived the battlefield. Credit networks formed, logistics became professions. Institutions learned to profit from continuity rather than victory. This is not a story about faith versus greed. It is a story about transformation, about how holy war rewired incentives, concentrated power, and laid the foundations for a permanent war economy that would shape Europe for centuries. Welcome here. By the late 11th century, Europe was not designed for distant warfare. It was violent, yes, but small-scale, local, and inefficient. Power did not flow through institutions. It moved through personal obligation. Kings ruled unevenly. Authority weakened the farther it traveled from the throne. Landed nobles controlled territory, but they controlled it in a form that could not easily be converted into action beyond their own borders. Wealth existed, but it was locked in place. Fields, forests, peasants, rents. These assets could sustain households and fund local conflict, but they could not be mobilized quickly. There were no national treasuries stocked with coin, no permanent taxation systems capable of collecting revenue across regions, no professional administrations built to plan, supply, and finance long campaigns abroad. Europe was rich in land and poor in liquidity. War reflected these limits. Fighting was seasonal. Armies assembled temporarily and dissolved just as quickly. Campaigns were short because resources were. Men fought close to home because distance multiplied cost. Every additional mile required food, animals, equipment, and coordination things medieval Europe struggled to provide even in peacetime. And yet, within a generation, tens of thousands of people would leave their homes and travel thousands of miles to fight in the eastern Mediterranean. They would cross unfamiliar terrain, negotiate hostile borders, and survive for months or years without local support. They would require armor, weapons, horses, ships, provisions, and logistics on a scale Europe had never sustained before. By any rational assessment, this should not have worked. The spark came in November of 1095 when Pope Urban II addressed the Council of Clermont. The message was framed in spiritual terms: reclaim Jerusalem, protect fellow Christians, secure salvation. But the effect of the speech extended far beyond theology. What Urban offered was not a military plan, but moral authorization. He legitimized violence that had previously been condemned. He redirected it outward. This mattered because Europe had a surplus problem not of money, but of warriors. Knights were trained for violence, socially defined by it, increasingly constrained by the Church's attempts to limit internal conflict. Younger sons inherited little. Household soldiers depended on war for status and income. The crusade offered them something rare, a sanctioned outlet for aggression wrapped in moral certainty. But the call was not addressed to kings with treasuries. It was addressed to individuals, men without centralized support, men who would have to pay their own way. Participation became a social signal. To take the cross was to demonstrate honor, loyalty, and piety. To refuse was to invite suspicion. Once leading nobles committed, pressure spread downward. The decision ceased to be purely voluntary. Faith opened the door, but social obligation pushed men through it. And they did not travel alone. Crusading forces were not professional armies. They were moving populations. Knights brought servants, laborers, clergy, craftsmen, and dependents. Every fighter required support. Every household added weight. The crusade was less a campaign than a migration one that exported Europe's internal tensions toward a distant frontier. It's created an immediate financial problem. Participation was expensive. For many knights, the cost of joining equaled several years of income. There were no stipends, no state funding, no central authority issuing pay. So participants liquidated. Land was sold quickly, often below value. Estates were mortgaged to monasteries. Loans were taken from moneylenders. Future harvests were pledged. Political favors were promised. Long-term stability became secondary to short-term cash. Salvation had a deadline. Debt could wait. This was the first transformation. War ceased to be something fought only with bodies. It became something organized through finance. And once war required financing, it began to attract those who specialized in moving money, goods, and risk. The shift was subtle at first, but irreversible. As crusading armies moved east, they exposed Europe's logistical weakness and created opportunity for those prepared to exploit it. Italian merchant republics were among the first to recognize what was happening. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa were not feudal societies. They were commercial ones. Their power rested not on land, but on ships, contracts, and credit. Crusaders did not simply need weapons. They needed transport, storage, supply chains, financing, insurance against loss. These cities did not fight holy wars for salvation alone. They sold solutions to a continent struggling to project force. By the early 12th century, routes carved by crusading armies doubled as trade corridors. Ports that serviced crusaders expanded rapidly. Shipyards multiplied. Legal contracts replaced informal obligation. What had begun as religious mobilization hardened into a logistics industry. The church observed all of this closely. It was not merely a spiritual authority. It was a trans-regional institution operating across fragmented kingdoms. It owned vast landholdings. It administered courts. It educated elites. It recorded births, marriages, and deaths. Most importantly, it commanded moral obedience beyond any king's reach. But it lacked one thing: a permanent fiscal system. The Crusades forced adaptation. Funding long campaigns required new revenue. Clergy were taxed. Laity were taxed. In some cases, payment replaced participation. Indulgences, once spiritual remedies, became financial instruments. Emergency collections were repeated. Piston created precedent. Precedent created permanence. Belief became leverage. As crusading continued, financial structures solidified. Military orders emerged to protect pilgrims and fight in the Holy Land. The Knights Templar, founded in the early 12th century, quickly evolved beyond combat. They accepted deposits. They transferred funds across borders. They issued early letters of credit, allowing travelers to access money without carrying it physically. By mid-century, the Templars operated one of Europe's most advanced financial networks. They wore armor, but they managed accounts. They combined religious legitimacy with financial expertise, insulating themselves from local authorities and taxes. Then came the Fourth Crusade. In 1202, Crusaders contracted Venice for transport east. The cost was enormous. When payment failed, Venice did not withdraw. It redirected the expedition first against Zara, then against Constantinople itself. In 1204, crusading forces sacked one of the richest Christian cities in the world. The outcome was devastating for Byzantium. It was extraordinarily profitable for Venice. Trade privileges expanded. Territory changed hands. Influence deepened. The crusade had not failed. It had simply followed incentives. By this point, a pattern was clear. Faith mobilized people. Finance determined outcomes. Institutions learned to extract value from moral language. War became sustainable not because it succeeded, but because it produced continuous economic activity. Europe did not plan this transformation. It learned it. And once learned, it did not forget. As crusading continued into its second century, battlefield results mattered less than the systems surrounding them. Jerusalem changed hands. Strongholds fell, enthusiasm faded. But the financial machinery endured. The primary beneficiaries were intermediaries. Merchant republics did not need crusades to succeed militarily. They needed them to persist. As long as armies moved east, ships sailed, supplies flowed, credit circulated. War became a commercial dependency. Risk distribution shifted. When crusades failed, losses were personal. Nobles who had sold land returned ruined or did not return at all. Peasants faced higher rents and taxes to service debts. Local economies destabilized as estates were liquidated under pressure. Meanwhile, institutions collected fees regardless of outcome. Logistics providers were paid. Creditors enforced contracts. Profits were institutional. Losses were individual. Military orders accelerated this imbalance. The Templars and Hospitallers accumulated land across Europe, received donations from those seeking spiritual insurance, and managed assets on a scale previously unknown. Exempt from many taxes and accountable only to the Pope. They operated across borders with ease, functioning as early multinational entities, insulated from the violence they financed. The Church adapted further. Temporary taxes became routine. Indulgences expanded. Justification mattered less than the revenue. Crusades were launched against new enemies, heretics, political rivals, even Christian cities. The definition of holy war expanded because the system required continuation. Peace became a threat, and there were others who paid the price. Jewish communities, often acting as lenders, became convenient scapegoats when debts grew politically inconvenient. Persecution followed. Wealth consolidated upward, not only through conquest, but through finance. This is the part often omitted. The Crusades did not simply drain Europe. They reorganized it. Power shifted from landed warriors to institutions fluent in credit, contracts, and scale. The medieval economy did not modernize by chance. It was forged under pressure, shaped by debt, and disciplined by conflict. By the late 13th century, the spiritual promise had eroded. Military victories were rare. Acre fell in 1291. The Holy Land was lost. But the systems built to sustain crusading remained. Taxation endured. War finance evolved. Merchant republics pivoted from crusade to empire. Europe had learned how to fund power. Once learned, the lesson proved impossible to unlearn. Modern wars wear different uniforms, but the architecture behind them is strikingly familiar. The slogans change. The symbols evolve. But the mechanics remain. Moral language still rallies populations. Financial systems still cushion institutions while shifting risk downward. Where crusaders once marched, contractors now deploy. Where vows once bound men, debt now binds states. And once again, the machinery endures long after the stated mission loses clarity. History does not loop neatly, but it educates relentlessly. The Crusades revealed something Europe would never unlearn. Belief can be converted into revenue. Permanence can be more profitable than victory, and violence becomes hardest to stop once it is engineered to sustain itself. The danger was never conviction itself, it was the systems built around it. Systems that require tension, conflict, and renewal to justify their own survival. Recognizing this pattern is not an exercise in cynicism. It is an exercise in literacy. Because societies that understand how power is financed are harder to manipulate by language alone. When money and authority move together under the banner of moral certainty, the costs are rarely absorbed by those issuing the calls. They're absorbed quietly, diffusely, and over time by people who never approved the design. If this reframed how you see history, stay with the channel. The past doesn't just explain where we came from. It reveals how systems think and how they repeat themselves.